Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Natalie is a mental health expert and a renowned speaker, researcher, and clinician. She is a psychology professor at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. And just a quick little detour, Spelman College, for those of you that are listening that are not based in the US, it's a historically Black college. It's a global leader in the education of women of African descent, and it's the nation's oldest institution of higher education for Black women. So it's a very well-known, historically Black, I guess what you might call it, HBCU in the US. And she's a psychology professor there. She's also the Diversity and Inclusion Education Director with Emory University Department of Psychiatry. In these roles, Dr. Natalie sustains an active research program investigating how stress and cultural factors influence African Americans' mental health attitudes and behaviors, as well as how to tailor mental health services to address African Americans' mental health needs. Also, as a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Natalie is the founder of NWS Wellness and Consulting, a psychological practice that specializes in providing evidence-based and culturally responsive psychological and wellness care to organizations and individuals. So I'm very excited to have her on the show today. So I want you to just tell us a little bit more about, your job and your professional interests, and how did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, so if I think about my professional interests, I strongly identify as a psychologist, researcher, and professor. So those three things really inform each other and inform the work that I do. It's really exciting to research topics that are relevant to our communities, then being able to bring those things into the classroom at a place like Spelman College and preparing the next generation of Black women psychologists and leaders and educators, but also being able to bring those insights into my clinical practice, my psychology practice, to really support the mental health of our communities.
Wow. I love the fact that you are helping to build up and train up the next generation of psychologists, and of women psychologists. I'm very excited by that. As folks out there may know, there is a need for more mental health providers, and particularly mental health providers of color. And at a historically Black university, you're training up the next generation of Black psychologists as well. And one of the things that I've kind of learned as I've gone along is the idea of the field of Black psychology, and the idea of how. And this is a little detour, but just the idea of how the way that psychology and psychiatry kind of evolved in the United States is that the thought leaders were always primarily white males. And so, of course, the way that psychology and psychiatry shape the way that people think, the theories, the way it's practiced, has been informed by that perspective. And so as the years progress and the generations progress, and we have a generation of diverse leadership, the way that psychology and psychiatry looks, the way that the people that inform the practice of it, the theory of it, eventually kind of broadens. And it's so exciting to know that we don't necessarily have to practice or believe the things just because historically that's the way things have always been done. And we can challenge the system, and we can kind of grow and kind of be out there.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's been exciting to be a part of challenging the system on kind of both ends, right? So, as a scholar, as a researcher, making sure that the theories and the perspectives and the research that's highlighted is sort of for us, by us. At the same time, making sure that I'm showing up, my students are showing up also in the clinical space. So being able to contribute to the research, but also to be a Black woman psychologist who's a part of shaping the next generation of Black women mental health professionals. It's just been really exciting.
Nice. And so Dr. Natalie, you're here today to talk to us a little bit about mindfulness.
Yes.
I know whenever I think of the word mindfulness, the image that comes to my mind, the picture that always goes with the blog, is a woman who is in a yoga pose and kind of holding her hands in a kind of a prayer pose with her eyes closed. Usually it's a white woman, sometimes not, but usually it is. And it's like this peaceful kind of Eastern meditation kind of situation. What is mindfulness?
It's so funny that you brought up the sort of image of who practices mindfulness and who mindfulness is for, because if I think about some of the qualitative research that I've done, and so qualitative research where you are going into the communities and interviewing people, asking them these different questions, when I would go into communities and ask, what is mindfulness? What do you think, or what comes to mind when you hear mindfulness? A lot of the work that I did with Black women started out with the sort of white hippy dippy woman, right? The sort of white woman who's at Whole Foods, who's into sort of new age spiritualism, gluten-free, right? Usually thin, usually blonde. And so there were so many ways in which who mindfulness was for was not seen as folks who look like us. And so simply put, mindfulness is a way of paying attention to the present moment, paying attention to the present without judgment and with curiosity, and being present with whatever comes up. So what we may be feeling in the present moment, what we may be thinking in the present moment, how our body feels in the present moment, sounds that may be present. And so really just being more in tune with our present experience. And it may sound simple, but it's actually quite radical, because for a lot of us, we spend a lot of time in the past, right? So replaying conversations that have already happened, that thing we wish we would have done differently last week, or we spend a lot of time in the future. Right. So thinking about the what ifs, the things that could happen, the grocery list that we got to put together, or the meal prep we have to do for the week. And so we spend so much time in the past and in the future. And mindfulness really is that invitation to be present.
Wow. So does it have anything to do with taking deep breaths? And do you have to stop what you're doing and stop and take deep breaths in order to do it? Because a lot of people tell me that deep breathing stuff doesn't work for me.
So how I like to think about it is you have the informal practice of mindfulness and the formal practice of mindfulness. So the informal practice is to just bring mindful attention to whatever it is that you're doing, right? So if you're eating, bringing all of your attention to the act of eating, right? Actually allowing yourself to taste your food, to smell the food, to look at the food, notice what sensations are present while you're eating. It could be being mindful as you're talking on the phone, right? Like, let's think about how many times we're on the phone and we're multitasking, right? We're sending an email, we're watching TV, we're cooking dinner. And so our attention is pulled in so many different directions. And so we can bring a mindful focus and attention to the things we are already doing. Okay. And then you have the quote unquote formal practice of mindfulness, is where you actually can engage in different practices to enhance your ability to focus and concentrate on the present moment. So paying attention to your breath. So there are mindfulness practices that entail noticing the breath. There are mindfulness practices that entail paying attention to different parts of the body, and so on.
Okay. So if a person wanted to do mindfulness, there's a lot of different ways that they can do it. And the idea of the breathing part of like, oh, I have to stop and take a deep breath, that's only one type.
Exactly.
But it's actually very accessible, because you can do it throughout your everyday experience. You don't necessarily have to stop and put on yoga pants and like sit in a pose to do it. You can do it while you're eating, while you're cooking, this sort of thing, because it's about being present, about kind of shifting your attention to what you're doing without kind of letting your mind drift to the past, to the future, and that sort of thing.
Exactly. Fully participating in whatever you're doing in the moment, right? So for folks listening to the podcast, bringing their full focus and attention to the podcast, that would be an act of mindfulness.
Okay. Wow. So, I mean, that sounds a lot simpler than I think people kind of make it seem, because I think when we think of mindfulness, we're thinking about the formal. where we are
Yes.
setting aside time, which it seems like that's also useful for people who have the desire to do so, to set aside time to do it formally.
Yeah, most definitely. It can be helpful, right? To sometimes it's helpful just to take a step back and to do 2 minutes of deep breathing, or to put on your favorite song and to bring your full attention to your presence, to your favorite song. And then, but it's also about integrating mindfulness into the world that we're already in.
So I guess in general, why should people even think about bringing their attention to the present? And, because I can imagine that when people are really busy, they think, I don't have time for this. Like, why should I make an effort to try to do mindfulness at all?
So I think one of the primary benefits of mindfulness is improved health. And improved health holistically. So, mindfulness has been associated with an array of outcomes. So, it has been found to reduce the experience of stress. It's also been found to improve sleep, improve concentration, to improve blood pressure, to decrease risk for diabetes, to also improve our mental health. So, there's research that supports that mindfulness can reduce depression, anxiety. And so I think one of the primary benefits, and at least the benefit that I often find myself most interested in as a psychologist, is the health benefits of mindfulness.
Wow. So over a period of time, it can actually help people to feel less stressed and
Yes.
less depressed. And so if they only do it one time or do it inconsistently, they may have benefits in the moment, but if they want to see those long-term kind of more, I guess, tangible kind of things that they can see that those benefits, if they practice it regularly, they'll be able to see.
Yeah, it's just like working out, right? Like I can go to the gym and I can feel really good that one time I go to the gym, right? I might even feel some benefits the next morning when I wake up, or a couple days afterwards. I may feel a little more energized. But in order to really maximize the benefits of going to the gym, I have to go consistently. And so, similarly, mindfulness is a practice. And for us to truly reap the benefits of that practice has to be consistent.
Okay. So then, when we think about how this practice may fit in with those of us in the Black community that it hasn't really been marketed to us in the same way. I mean, one might argue, oh, it's universal, it's been marketed to everybody. But as you've probably, as you found out when you kind of spoke with people, and as I think about when I think what's the image that pops to my mind, I realize it hasn't really been marketed to us. And so why should we pay attention to it in the Black community?
Yeah. First, I really just want to highlight and just affirm and validate what you mentioned about the idea that mindfulness hasn't really been marketed towards us. If I think about the research that I've done, as well as my own experience practicing mindfulness, I remember one of the first mindfulness retreats that I went to, I was asked to leave my purse at the door. And I don't know about you, but when I walk into unfamiliar
No
places,
way.
I'm not leaving my purse by the door, right? Nor if I walk into a place and I'm being asked to sit on a cushion, like all of those things were very unfamiliar, right? Also growing up in a religious family, in a Christian family, like if I think about perhaps going to church, I wasn't leaving my purse at the door, I wasn't sitting on cushions, right? So there was nothing about the sort of white centric mindfulness space that felt familiar to me. And those were the things that we were hearing even in our research, right? Not just in terms of the images of who it was marketed for, but even the props and the setup felt very unfamiliar. And so, if I think about why we should care about this, on the flip side, I think about there's a professor, Dr. Veronica Womack out of Northwestern, and she did a study back in 2017 that looked at the messages of mindfulness and how some of it overlaps with racial socialization messages. And when Dr. Womack is talking, she talks about this story of how every morning when her grandmother would get ready, she would take a moment just to put her lotion on. And in that moment, right, it was all about putting the lotion on and just giving her that space to put her lotion on. And what that highlighted to me is I think for a lot of us, we have been doing mindfulness. We may not have been calling it mindfulness, but every time we take that breath, every time we take that moment just to be still, every time we take that moment just to kind of put that lotion on, we're practicing mindfulness. And so I think it was more so about highlighting this practice that already exists in our communities and increasing our practice and connecting how this practice that we may already do is connected to all of these health benefits.
So for us to kind of understand how we're actually not so far away from
Exactly.
doing this, and it really isn't as foreign as we have made it. Because as you mentioned, being kind of from this Christian background, I know one of the things that I've kind of always heard is like, oh, it's Eastern religion, and this Eastern religion is then in conflict with Christian beliefs, and so you need to kind of not engage in it. But then over time, I came to realize that you can practice mindfulness in a way that does not, it's not really about religious belief. It's
Yeah.
a practice that's about shifting attention. So you can shift your attention to whatever you want. You could mindfully kind of meditate on scriptures, whatever you kind of choose. So it's really not that it's not so different from what we've been doing.
Exactly. And I think that's part of the critique. I think the way that it has been co opted in white spaces makes it feel unfamiliar and foreign, when in fact, I think a lot of the work that I've been doing more recently and that my colleagues have been doing is sort of reclaiming aspects of mindfulness that are already indigenous to our communities.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Wow. One of the things that I wanted to kind of talk specifically about, and we had kind of alluded to it earlier, was about this idea of breath and breathing, and that one of the things that we can focus on is the breath. And for me, I've always liked that aspect of mindfulness. Whenever I've gone over like relaxation exercises, either on my own or if I'm guiding like a patient through it. I always like this idea of having them focus on you don't have to breathe deeply, just focus on how your breath feels going in and out, focus on the temperature, focus on the expansion of your chest as you take air in, and like just kind of focus on these sorts of things. And I've always liked that aspect. But then I thought, breath, the idea of breath has some significance in the Black community. Can you talk a little bit about how that might fit in for us?
Yeah, just if I think about one of the reasons why the breath is the sort of go-to in a lot of mindfulness practices is because the breath is the thing that's always present with us, right? So if we think about mindfulness as a practice that allows us to kind of cue into the present moment, well, our breath is always there. It's the thing that always brings us back to the here and now. If I think about, and we know that there's physiological significance of the breath, right? When we are focusing on the breath, we're able to sort of activate that parasympathetic nervous system, that part of the nervous system that sort of brings us back down from that place of intense arousal and stress. And if we think about the significance of the breath in the Black communities, I remember in one of my recent mindfulness projects, I was putting together some scripts or content for mindfulness practices. And like you said, there are so many practices that focus on just sort of noticing the breath, the temperature of the breath, the rise and fall of the chest or the abdomen. And I said, this is what does it mean to invite people to focus on the breath when we have the protest chants of I can't breathe in the background? And if we think about, especially for us as Black people living in this moment in time, what does that mean, right? To like hold space to honor our breath alongside the reality that so many of our community members, so many of our ancestors have literally had their breath cut short. Um, and I think that's the significance of the breath. And I even wrote a practice about that. Like every time that we focus on the breath, we are actually connecting with a part of us that signals that we are still here, and we are honoring those from our communities who have had their breath cut short.
I can, as you're saying that, in my mind's eye, I can see like a collective process, like a collective healing process. Like, and I can visualize, folks kind of standing in a circle and to honor those that have lost their lives and kind of saying, let's do this. And in a way, kind of do this mindfulness exercise. Let's pay attention to what it feels like for us to breathe in and out and just focus our attention on our own breath and the significance of it and how that could be both, I don't know, like an introspective kind of thing. But you also use a phrase like holding space for it. And so I think it can be a kind of healing. As you mentioned, like this is one of the benefits of mindfulness is that it kind of helps with our mental health in that way. And I think that's, for me, one of the things that distinguishes it, from just a relaxation exercise, which is what a lot of times we think it is, is just something meant to relax us. And it's like not necessarily a relaxation exercise, but more of a practice that helps us to increase our capacity to hold different emotions and different experiences.
Yeah. And to hold it in a different way than many of us have been socialized to hold it, right? So if I think about my own socialization and the socialization of the many of the clients that I've worked with and the research participants that I've engaged with, the holding really is, or the socialization message really is to keep it moving, right? It's to hold it and suppress it. Whereas mindfulness is an invitation to sort of hold it, make space for it, to acknowledge it, and then to see what it's like to let it go, to not become sort of attached to it and get lost in it or consumed in it.
So there's kind of this invitation to, I guess, one of the phrases I've heard is like kind of lean in a little bit. So I know that when it's sometimes discussed just in like universal kind of circles, they'll say, let's say, for example, you're holding on to anxiety or holding on to anger. You can like lean into the feeling, the emotion of it, and just explore that emotion, kind of explore the things that are real. How does that make your body feel? Da, 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 da. You lean into it for a period of time. And then basically the whole goal of it is that over a period of time, you will increase your capacity to kind of like tolerate this negative emotion. Because as you mentioned, there's kind of this thing about either avoiding it, not talking about it, moving along, trying to brush it off, except that the emotion is still being held in our bodies.
Exactly.
So it's still influencing us. It's still stress, causing a rise in stress hormones, all these things. And so by leaning into it in a non-judgmental way, we increase our, I guess we kind of have some kind of relationship with it, kind of come to terms with it. We can kind of be able to understand it and kind of not become as attached to it. Is that, you might be able to describe it better than me.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great description. I know one of the common sort of metaphors is learning to, treating our emotions like a wave, right? And we kind of learn how to ride them like you would with the surfboard, right? We don't run away from the wave. We don't allow the wave to consume us or to, take us offshore, but we learn to ride it. And that's one of the, I think, benefits of mindfulness is it helps us change our relationship to our emotional experience.
But it's also validating it at the same time. Because I think a lot of times, I know one of the things that we, sometimes in traditional therapies, is this idea of trying to kind of just, I don't know, make things go away. Like, for example, if you're treating anxiety, you're trying to make the anxiety go away versus, as you mentioned, like riding the wave, where you're not just trying to make it go away, you're you're really kind of you're kind of making space for it.
Yeah, learning how to navigate it, right? So if I think about changing our relationship to anxiety, even if I wanted to change anxiety, right? Even if I wanted to reduce its intensity, I'd still have to name it as anxiety. It's hard to change something that we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And so that's also part of the validation process, is being able to sit with it long enough to call it by its name, to
Yeah.
acknowledge it, and acknowledge where it's come from, right? And acknowledge how we want to proceed, right? Do I want to just kind of let this naturally pass because most of our thoughts and emotions do? Or if it's getting in the way of me doing what I need to do, how might I go about changing it in a way that's helpful?
And I wanted to just kind of mention for folks that may be listening from, of course, multiple different backgrounds, that over the last year and more, there's been a lot of different kind of discourse about racial reconciliation and this sort of thing. There's been a lot of challenging discussions people have had to kind of handle discomfort and anger and all of that. And it seems like mindfulness could be a practice that could help with even the feelings that many of us of multiple backgrounds might experience during this time: the discomfort, the anger, the confusion. That this is something that people could use to help them to kind of to kind of get through this as well, and to both validate their emotions, but also kind of get through that as well.
Yeah, and I think ultimately respond in an effective way, right? When
Yeah.
we're responding from an emotionally like laden place, like when I'm responding from an anxious place, right? That might be a different kind of responding than if I've had time to kind of sit with the anxiety and kind of explore, like, okay, well, what's kind of driving that anxiety? Where is that coming from? And then I'm able to make a more mindful decision about how to proceed. And I think, particularly in anti-racism work, if we think about folks who are trying to support different communities, it's important that they have the necessary emotional resources to engage in this work in a sustainable way. And I think mindfulness is one of those strategies to help build the emotional capacity for anti-racism.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, one of the things I had wanted you to talk about too was I had heard that you were maybe working, doing some research on an app,
Yeah.
and I wanted to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so my colleagues and I have been fortunate to receive two grants from the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health. It's one of the largest federal funders of research. And so the exciting thing about it, it's our taxpayer dollars going to good work to support the health and wellness of Black communities. And so as a psychologist and researcher and personal practitioner of mindfulness, I've really been excited about how can we then take mindfulness and all the good that it does and make it accessible on a wide scale. I know that there are so many barriers to people receiving sort of one on one individual treatment, like therapy, psychiatry services. And so, what if we were able to take, again, the good work of mindfulness and make it widely accessible? And so, one of the ways to do that is through the use of technology. And there has been growing interest, growing support for what we call M-health or mobile health, which is being able to use and leverage our phones to support our health practices. And so, with the support of grant funding, we have developed a fully powered app for Black individuals specifically. All of the content is written by Black mindfulness practitioners. All of the practices are guided by Black voice actors or Black people. That was one of the things that we were
Oh,
also
yes,
hearing a lot
yes.
about in
Yes,
our.
because a lot of people would do these meditation apps, and they're like starting to feel uncomfortable because of voice on these meditation
Yes.
apps were like clearly no one that sounded like them or anyone in their families.
Exactly. And I remember one of the studies that we were doing where we sent women home with one of the standard mindfulness CDs. And they were like, after a long day working with white folks, the last thing I want to do is go home, listen to a white voice tell me to relax. It was actually not relaxing. And so all of the practices are offered again by Black voice actors. And we were also able to partner with different Black mindfulness practitioners across the US who put their own unique sort of brand and spin on mindfulness. So we have Sean Moore from Atlanta, who has provided a drum circle practice, who's also provided some other sort of rhythmic practices into the app. We have Dr. Michelle Chapman, who is a vocalist, so several of the practices are her singing. And again, it was about reclaiming, again, a lot of those practices that are already representative in our communities and connecting those to how we do mindfulness to support our own health and wellness. And so it's just been an exciting project to be about, to be a part of.
So how long, how long have you been working on it? Do you know when you'll be finished with the project?
Yeah, so we have been working on it since about 2016, 2017. And again, like most research, it takes a while to develop it, pilot it, test it. We also found in the initial pilot that it was effective in reducing stress and improving people's ability to regulate their emotions. Also, participants resoundingly felt like it was relevant to their lives. And we saw significant differences in the use of mindfulness behavior. So people actually reported using mindfulness more after engaging with the app. The plan is we are wrapping up the final phase of data collection, and the plan is to officially launch the commercialized version of it later this year or early next year.
Nice. Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
That sounds so interesting to me. I would definitely, when that's available, make sure to kind of send me a link
Oh, most definitely.
to that. I can share it with folks because that sounds amazing. And unlike pretty much any other app that I've kind of tried or used, which I mean, their other apps are fine. It's nothing that they're not bad, but it'd be so great to get an app that has kind of some specialized tailoring.
Yeah.
For the.
And as a scientist, I value having tools that are empirically supported that also reflect our cultural wisdom, right? We can have both. We can have tools that are just for us that also are backed by the science.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would be interested too to see in much the same way that, say, if someone made these other apps that are kind of meant to be, again, marketed as universal. When you have an app that's designed very specifically with one community in mind, how other communities that use the app might also benefit from that as well. And it'd be so interesting to hear like kind of more like a follow-up of once it's launched, of how people maybe of other backgrounds, other cultural heritages also might enjoy and benefit from it as well, and kind of like what their thoughts are. I think that would be so interesting to hear. So,
oh, most definitely.
Yeah. So I'm excited for that. I don't know if you have a name for the app yet, or if you're allowed to say until you're finished, but
we're working on it.
Okay. So usually I kind of towards the end of an interview, I like to ask folks what they enjoy the most about their work and what they find kind of fulfilling and rewarding. What do you enjoy the most about being a psychologist and researcher, and this sort of thing?
I would say the synergy between my roles. I think that's enjoyable. Sometimes we, especially those of us who like diversity in our professional life, can feel pulled in many different directions. And although I do have various different tasks, there is this common thread through all of them, right? Like the common thread in my psychology practice, my research, my teaching is about improving the lives of, improving the health of our communities. And so I think just the synergy and the congruence between my activities is something that I find most rewarding. And I really enjoy sharing information. And so, whatever platform I get to do that through, such as this or through the classroom, those are the things that really energize me.
Oh, and so would you, for folks listening, would you recommend that other kind of young people coming up that they should become psychologists? Is it a field that is, that you would encourage other people to get into?
Absolutely. And I, in addition to becoming psychologists, would definitely encourage younger folks to even research all of the diverse career paths within psychology. I think as a field, that's one of the things that I want us to do a better job of highlighting is that there aren't just these traditional paths of academia or private practice, but that there is a global need for the skills and insight that psychologists have.
Well, thank you so much. I think this was a really great discussion. I appreciate you kind of clarifying a bit more about what mindfulness really is and why it's relevant to our community. And I look forward to kind of hearing more about the app once it's finished. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And thanks for those of you out there that have been listening in live or will listen later. So this will be available on Facebook and YouTube and will be uploaded later in the week on Apple Podcasts. So thank you so much for listening in and have a great week.